There is a cheese that the European Union banned in 2002 that the Guinness Book of World Records certified as the most dangerous food product on the continent, and that Sardinian shepherds have been making for over 2,000 years with no intention of stopping. It does not contain an unusual mold. It does not use a rare bacterial culture or an unconventional aging method. It contains living maggots, thousands of them. And when those maggots die, the cheese is considered spoiled and unsafe to eat. This is Casu Marzu, and the ban did not end the tradition, it made it more expensive. Casu Marzu translates from the Sardinian dialect as rotten cheese. That is not a marketing description or a rebranding exercise for a food label. It is the direct, literal translation of what the cheese is called by the people who make it. It begins as pecorino sardo, the traditional sheep's milk cheese that Sardinian shepherds have produced for millennia, and it starts its life in an entirely conventional way. At a specific point in the aging process, a fly called Piophila casei, the cheese skipper, is introduced, either intentionally or by deliberate exposure. It lays its eggs in the cracks of the rind. Those eggs hatch within days, and the larvae that emerge begin to consume the paste from the inside out. The name was never changed because the people who make it never needed to market it to anyone but themselves. Sardinia is the second largest island in the Mediterranean, and it is one of the most geographically isolated food cultures in Europe. Its cheese-making traditions developed without access to the aristocratic patrons who commissioned refined products for continental courts, without the monastic aging cellars that produced many of Europe's great cheeses, and without the trading networks that carried Northern European cheese culture across borders during the medieval period. What Sardinian shepherds had was sheep, salt, thyme, and the specific environmental conditions of the Mediterranean, including the flies that naturally inhabited their aging rooms. Casu Marzu did not diverge from the mainstream European cheese-making tradition. It preceded it along a completely separate evolutionary branch that the rest of the food world never developed and until very recently never knew existed. The fly responsible for Casu Marzu is Piophila casei, known in English as the cheese skipper. It is found throughout the Mediterranean and across temperate Europe, and under normal circumstances it is classified as a contaminant, a pest that commercial cheese producers work actively to exclude from their aging facilities. In Sardinia, in the specific context of Casu Marzu production, the logic is inverted. The fly is not excluded. It is allowed access to selected wheels of aging pecorino sardo at a precise point in the maturation timeline. It lays its eggs in the cracks of the rind. The eggs hatch in a matter of days, and the larvae, approximately 8 millimeters in length, transparent and continuously mobile, begin their work inside the paste. Every other cheese tradition in the world treats this fly as a problem. Sardinia turned it into a production instrument. The larvae feed on the fat content of the cheese, and as they feed, they produce enzymes that trigger lipolysis, the breakdown of fat molecules into fatty acids. Lipolysis is the same fundamental biochemical process that underlies the flavor development of all aged cheese, but the larvae drive it at a rate and intensity that no bacterial starter culture or mold inoculation can approach. The paste softens progressively from the center outward, reaching a near-liquid consistency at the edges in mature wheels. In the most advanced stages of fermentation, a pale amber liquid gathers at the base of the cheese inside the rind. It has a specific name in Sardinian, lagrima. It means tears. The flavor does not come from the larvae themselves. It comes from what the larvae unlock inside the fat chemistry of the cheese. The lagrima is the element of Casu Marzu that serious food writers return to most consistently in their accounts of eating it. Those who have consumed the cheese in its traditional context, in Sardinia, at the correct stage of fermentation, prepared in the way it has been prepared for 2,000 years, describe the flavor as the most concentrated expression of sheep's milk that exists in any cheese format in the world. Sharp, complex, and deeply savory, with a heat that builds slowly at the back of the throat and a faint sweetness underneath that is specific to the quality of Sardinian milk. The people dismissing Casu Marzu based on its biological content are reacting to information. The people who have actually eaten it are reacting to flavor. and what they describe is not a curiosity. It is an extraordinary food experience. Casu Marzu is traditionally served with pan carasau, the ancient, thin, crisp Sardinian flatbread baked on the island for over 3,000 years, and paired with cananau, the local red wine recognized for having one of the highest resveratrol concentrations of any wine in Europe. Some tasters remove the larvae before eating. Many do not. The reason for not removing them is not performative. It is diagnostic. A wheel of Casu Marzu, where the larvae remain active and living, is a wheel that is still in correct fermentation. A wheel where the larvae have died is a wheel that has turned, past the point of safety by the standards of the tradition. The living larvae are not the warning. They are the quality control. This is a 2,000-year-old safety system, operating on entirely different logic than any food safety regulation that came after it. If this story is worth your time, a like tells the algorithm to put it in front of someone else who would appreciate it. Subscribe to Origins of Cheese. Every video on this channel starts with a question the mainstream food world decided was not worth asking, and follows it until we find out what is actually at the other end. We are less than halfway through the most documented cheese controversy in European regulatory history. Stay with it. The health question cannot be dismissed, and it should be addressed directly. Piophila casei larvae are not sterile. Under specific circumstances, they can survive gastric acid and cause a condition called enteric-miasis, a gastrointestinal infestation in which larvae persist in the digestive tract and produce symptoms ranging from nausea to intestinal lesions. Documented cases exist in the medical literature, and they were the formal basis for the EU's regulatory action. The counter-argument from Sardinian producers and from researchers who studied traditional production methods is this: the specific biological conditions of Casu Marzu consumption, the acidity of the fermented cheese, the age and activity of the larvae at point of consumption, and the preparation context, create a risk profile substantially different from what a standardized contamination model implies. The EU was not wrong to ask the question. The argument is about whether the answer the regulation produced was the accurate one. When Italian food scientists began formally examining Casu Marzu in the early 2000s, their initial focus was on the fermentation chemistry rather than the safety profile. The results were significant. The amino acid and fatty acid concentrations of finished Casu Marzu were measurably distinct from standard pecorino aged for equivalent periods under conventional methods. The short-chain fatty acid content was substantially higher. Specific bioactive peptides, associated in separate research contexts with antioxidant and antimicrobial activity, were present in concentrations not found in conventionally aged sheep's milk cheese. These findings were not proposed for any clinical application, and they have not been replicated at commercial scale. But they represent a layer of the Casu Marzu story that the food media, focused almost entirely on the danger narrative, has consistently failed to examine. The science behind this cheese is not less interesting than the legend. In several respects, it is more interesting. In 2002, the European Union banned Casu Marzu under Regulation EC 178/2002, which established the foundational principles of EU food law and prohibited the sale of food deemed unsafe for human consumption. By any reading of that regulation, a cheese containing living invertebrates qualified for prohibition without ambiguity. The ban was not directed specifically at Casu Marzu. It was a consequence of a broad food safety architecture applied uniformly across all member states, without differentiation for traditional production contexts. The effect on Sardinian producers was immediate. A product they had made and sold for 2,000 years was now illegal to distribute. There was no phase-out period, no transitional exemption, and no mechanism for the traditional context to be formally assessed before the prohibition applied. The regulation was not written with Casu Marzu in mind. It simply did not need to be. What happened to Casu Marzu after the ban is a precise case study in the economics of prohibited food products. The cheese had never been formally distributed. It moved through personal local networks in the communities where it was produced and consumed. The ban pushed that informal distribution further underground, and as it went underground, the price rose. Before 2002, Casu Marzu sold for roughly twice the price of comparable aged pecorino. After the ban, reported prices in the informal market were 3 to 4 times higher. The product that the regulation intended to remove from the food system had become more valuable because of the regulation. The ban accomplished something the market had never managed on its own. It made Casu Marzu internationally famous, while simultaneously ensuring that the supply it made famous could not be formally increased. The Guinness Book of World Records formally certified Casu Marzu as the world's most dangerous cheese in 2009. This was not a novelty distinction. It was a citation grounded in the documented biological content of the product and its official EU prohibited status. The international response was not what any regulatory authority had anticipated. Food journalists flew to Sardinia specifically to eat something they could not legally purchase at home. Michelin-starred chefs gave interviews about the experience. Documentary food media ran investigations. The EU ban, combined with the Guinness certification, had created a product with something no marketing budget can engineer: genuine forbidden status, and the demand that follows forbidden status reliably in every market where it appears. The most effective publicity Casu Marzu ever received came from the institution that was trying to eliminate it. The history of Casu Marzu does not begin with the EU ban or the Guinness record. It begins, by best available scholarly evidence, approximately 2,000 years before any regulatory framework existed to have an opinion about it. Historical accounts referencing larval fermented cheese production in Sardinia predate the Roman colonization of the island in the 3rd century BCE. The Nuragic civilization, the Bronze Age culture responsible for the distinctive stone towers still visible across the Sardinian landscape, maintained sheep herds and produced fermented dairy products as a core component of their agricultural economy. Scholars examining the continuity of Sardinian pastoral practices place the origins of larval fermentation techniques within this period. 2,000 years of uninterrupted production is not a cultural anecdote. It is a dataset. The continuity of the tradition is not a matter of mythology. It is structural. Sardinia's geography isolated its communities from the forces that shaped mainland European food culture for extended periods. There was no aristocratic food culture commissioning refined cheeses for noble courts, no monastic tradition of controlled cellar aging, no access to the trade routes that carried Northern European cheese culture across the continent during the medieval centuries. What Sardinian shepherds had was sheep, coastline, a dry Mediterranean climate, and the specific insect life that shared their landscape. The food culture produced by those conditions was autonomous. Casu Marzu is not a regional variation on a European cheesemaking theme. It is the product of a completely independent evolutionary branch, one that the rest of Europe never developed. It did not diverge from the mainstream tradition. It preceded it. The knowledge required to produce Casu Marzu correctly is not transferable through a written recipe or formal training program. It is observational and embodied, accumulated through years of direct participation in the production cycle across seasons. The producers who do it correctly know which wheels of pecorino to select for larval introduction. They know the precise aging stage at which the process begins. They know, from texture, smell, and appearance alone, when fermentation is proceeding correctly and when it is not. This knowledge cannot be encoded in a production manual, cannot be reproduced in a commercial facility, and cannot be taught to someone who has not been present inside the cycle for long enough to read it directly. Food safety regulators work with documentation. This tradition works with memory. The two systems have very different vulnerabilities, and the vulnerability of the memory system is always the same. It ends when the generation that carries it stops passing it on. There is a biochemical dimension to the Casu Marzu story that the food media has consistently underreported, focused as it is on the danger narrative and the legal controversy. The larval fermentation process does not only alter texture and flavor, it measurably changes the nutritional composition of the finished product. The fat breakdown produces a set of short-chain fatty acids and bioactive peptides, not present in standard pecorino aged through conventional methods. Research into the amino acid profile of Casu Marzu found concentrations of specific peptides associated in laboratory contexts with antioxidant and antimicrobial activity. These findings have not been replicated at scale and have not been proposed for any medical application. But they represent a layer of the story that the luxury food narrative, which centers on danger and exclusivity, consistently omits. The science behind this cheese is not less interesting than the legend. In several respects, it is more interesting, and it has barely been examined. In 2002, Italy designated Casu Marzu as a traditional agri-food product under the National PAT classification, which provides legal protections for traditional foods that would otherwise conflict with EU food safety standards at the member state level. This protection does not override EU law across borders. Casu Marzu remains illegal to export to any other EU member state. But it means that production and sale within Sardinia operates under a recognized formal framework, not purely through black market channels. The informal distribution network that had expanded rapidly between 2002 and the PAT designation contracted, though it did not disappear. The PAT protection was not a full legal resolution. It was a negotiated pause in a regulatory argument that had not been concluded, and it left the fundamental question whether a 2,000-year-old production tradition can coexist with a 50-year-old food safety framework, unanswered. In 2020, a group of Sardinian producers formally petitioned the European Food Safety Authority to re-examine the Casu Marzu prohibition. The petition argued that the original 2002 risk assessment had applied a generalized contamination standard designed for industrial food production to a traditional food product consumed in a specific, historically continuous context, and that this application was not analytically appropriate. The petition cited the documented absence of mass illness events linked to traditional Casu Marzu consumption across its known production history. The European Food Safety Authority accepted the petition for formal review. A final public determination had not been issued as of the most recent available record. The outcome of that review will determine whether Casu Marzu can operate within a legal European framework, or whether it continues, as it has since 2002, at the outer legal boundary of the continent that created it. The broader tension in the Casu Marzu story is not unique to this cheese. The same friction appears across every traditional food that developed before modern regulatory frameworks existed and then encountered those frameworks as they expanded. Raw milk cheeses, traditionally fermented meats, naturally preserved fish. Each of these has faced the same foundational question. When the safety record of a food product is established, not by laboratory testing, but by continuous production across 2,000 years, without documented population-level harm, which form of evidence takes precedence? The EU's food safety framework answers in one direction. Sardinian producers answer in the other. The disagreement is not about facts. It is about which kind of evidence carries authority. And every food regulatory system in the world has already chosen a side. The cultural significance of Casu Marzu inside Sardinia is not reducible to food tourism or deliberate provocation. For the families where it is made, it is an identity marker, a product that belongs to a specific landscape, a specific animal, and a specific way of living within that landscape across generations. Sardinians do not present Casu Marzu to outsiders as a challenge or a performance. They present it because it is theirs, and because sharing it carries the same social weight that sharing any deeply traditional food carries in any culture. The international media's consistent framing of the cheese as extreme or dangerous is understood in Sardinia as a misreading, an external interpretive lens applied to something that, within its own context, is simply food. The people who find it disturbing and the people who find it extraordinary are both reacting to the same thing, a food culture that developed without reference to their expectations. There are no PDO certifications, no organic designations, and no artisanal quality marks available for Casu Marzu under any European framework because the production method is incompatible with the requirements of every certification category that exists. The product occupies a category of its own, formally recognized within Italy, formally prohibited across the rest of the EU, and entirely absent from the global commodity market. There is no futures market for Casu Marzu, no wholesale distributor, no supply chain, no recorded annual production figure. A small number of families in Sardinia make it each season, move it through personal networks, and produce a quantity that cannot be meaningfully measured because no official record of production is required. In the most literal sense, this is a cheese that does not officially exist. And yet, it is one of the most discussed food products in European history, and demand for it has never been higher than it is now. The question that Casu Marzu ultimately forces is precise. It is not whether the EU food safety framework is philosophically correct. It is not whether traditional food knowledge has moral authority over institutional food science. The question it forces is this: when a food production method has operated continuously for 2,000 years, in a specific context, without recorded population-level harm, what authority does a 50-year-old regulatory institution have to end it on the basis of a standardized risk model that was not designed to assess it? This is a genuine policy question that food historians, archaeologists, public health researchers, and legal scholars have each approached from different angles without reaching consensus. The EU has answered the question with a regulation. Sardinia has answered it with continued production. Both answers are still standing, and neither shows any sign of giving way. The future of Casu Marzu is genuinely uncertain on multiple fronts simultaneously. The EFSA review petition is the most significant legal development in the cheese's modern history, and its outcome will determine the regulatory framework within which production either stabilizes or continues at the margins. But the legal situation is only part of the question. The families currently making Casu Marzu are doing so in a Sardinian pastoral economy that is changing, and the generation that will inherit the tradition has options that did not exist for their grandparents. Whether those options pull them away from the aging rooms and the sheep pastures where this tradition lives is a question that no food safety authority can answer. The most expensive loss in this story would not be the cheese itself. It would be the 2,000 years of accumulated observational knowledge that produces it. Knowledge that exists nowhere else, in no other form, and cannot be reconstructed once it is gone. What makes Casu Marzu a significant story beyond the boundaries of the food world is what it represents at the intersection of cultural preservation, institutional authority, and the limits of regulatory systems. The cheese is not only a fermented product under safety scrutiny. It is a knowledge system, an accumulation of observational expertise built over 2,000 years of direct engagement with a specific landscape, a specific animal, and a specific biological process. That knowledge system is not backed up anywhere. It lives in a small number of families in a specific region of Sardinia, and it is transmitted entirely through direct mentorship, one generation to the next, with no formal record in any archival system. The EU ban threatened the conditions under which that transmission occurs. The PAT designation created some protection. The outcome of the EFSA review may determine whether protection becomes permanence or whether the margin narrows further. Casu Marzu is not the only traditional European food facing this tension, but it is the most extreme case currently in active regulatory dispute. The pattern it represents, a pre-industrial food production method encountering a regulatory architecture designed for industrial food systems, will produce more cases as European food governance continues to develop. The tools for resolving that tension are being built, partly in response to cases like this one, cultural heritage law, traditional food protection frameworks, risk assessment models that can account for historical production contexts. Casu Marzu is not only a food story. It is a test case for how modern governance handles knowledge it did not create and cannot fully evaluate. The answer that European food law gives to this specific case will shape how it handles every similar case that follows. What remains at the center of this story, after the regulatory history, the Guinness certification, the black market economics, and the EFSA petition, is the cheese itself. The accounts from those who have eaten Casu Marzu in its correct context are consistent in their conclusions. This is one of the most intense, complex, and singular flavor experiences the European cheese tradition has ever produced. Sharp, deeply savory, with a heat that builds over time, and a sweetness underneath that is specific to the quality of Sardinian sheep's milk. The people who dismiss it based on its biological content are describing their reaction to information, not to flavor. The Sardinians who have been eating it for 2,000 years are not eating it for a thrill or a credential. They are eating it because it is extraordinary. That is the part of the story that does not appear in the Guinness record citation, and it is the part that matters most. That is the Casu Marzu investigation. Leave a comment with your answer to this specific question. If you had access to it, right context, right preparation, right stage of fermentation, would you eat it? I genuinely want to know. If this is the kind of story you came here for, subscribe to Origins of Cheese. Every video on this channel starts with a question the mainstream food world decided was not worth asking. A like tells the algorithm to put this in front of someone who would appreciate it. And if you stayed until the end of this one, thank you. The next story is already waiting.